New tonight, we heard a mixture of cheers and jeers during Nebraska Congressman's town hall in Bellevue tonight. First Alert 6's Andrew Pfeiffer was there. He joins us live in the studio. Andrew?
Brian, there was certainly a lot to talk about this evening at Bellevue West High School. Everything from the housing bill, rescheduling medical marijuana, health care, and much more. It got to a point where even the audience was divided and then began yelling at each other. Chaos rings out at Bellevue West High School.
You are putting everyone in this country, including our uniformed officers who are acting within the law, in mortal danger.
Nebraska Congressman Mike Flood taking questions from the public.
Scams and the big ugly bill.
Some of it, not questions, but comments.
Okay, you asked and I...
The town hall itself, I think, I wish there was more decorum, honestly, whether you agree or disagree.
Dom and Shelley Gillen of Bellevue have been advocates for their son for years. Will has a severe seizure disorder. They wanted to know why the state continues to slow roll what the people voted for, medical marijuana, and why the state has targeted caregivers with restrictive reimbursements.
He tried to answer the questions, but I think he kind of talked around things. And unfortunately, I don't think he has all the information that here in the state when it comes to the question that I asked about the waiver services.
I think we made a grave mistake at the ballot box when we expanded medical marijuana.
I think the medical cannabis question, he did not answer directly or make a firm statement about it.
A lot of young men that end up living into their 20s in their parents' basement, smoking the weed, looking at the online porn.
But we can tell you right now that his seizure, or that cannabis is much safer than his seizures are.
Things got so escalated, members of the audience started yelling at each other.
It makes it hard. It makes it a little bit difficult to get questions answered completely.
Another topic included Flood's 21st Century Housing Act, a bill the president was supposed to sign last week before canceling the ceremony. It will become law by the end of the week, with or without Trump's signature.
President Trump is unconventional, very unconventional. But I will say this, he has been the same guy since the day he walked on that stage in 2014.
The 90-minute town hall left many voters unsatisfied.
I understand people are frustrated. I mean, we're frustrated too.
Congressman Flood says he hopes to host more town halls later in the year. The dates for those have not yet been announced. Reporting live in the studio, Andrew Pfeiffer, First Alert 6.
Andrew, thanks.